Thank you very much. Welcome, welcome. Right, we are going to talk about the things that have changed in the last few weeks and the things that haven't changed in the last few years. I'm Andy, founder at Control Plane. I'm also CISO here at Open UK, where we work to advance the state of open source, open data, and open hardware, especially where it comes to building people up and building community and attempting to advise governments in a positive direction. And we're going to jump straight into it. This is what things looked like quite recently. It took a lot of compute and a lot of cost to train these models. So we start off with the original transformer model that everything was ultimately built on, came out of Google, didn't cost too much. And as the size of the data sets and the number of training loops that data is put through increases, so does the required compute time. So that is either the purchase and runtime in electricity terms of that hardware, or it is the rental of that compute. Obviously, it's much cheaper to buy it. And this is moving things out of the realms of academia, where a lot of things started. These giant models become ultimately too expensive for anybody but the biggest companies in the world and the biggest countries and nations to actually be involved in, to actually generate any value from. So we thought the moat was up. Standard & Poor 500 index, propped up by the Magnificent Seven, all the tech stocks, buying GPUs from NVIDIA, NVIDIA going higher, everything self-reinforcing. Of course, NVIDIA benefits hugely from that capex. And then this happened. A software-optimized model bucked the trend of capital expenditure and hardware requirements to climb up these LLM competition indexes, rising to the top of the pile. But it is not constrained by Western-style laws, and it's not a victim of the chip embargo that was supposed to deepen the moat and keep the Magnificent Seven at the top of the AI game. So where does this leave us in open source? How open source are these models anyway? And where does security apply? Well, unfortunately, we're still at the point where it's quite easy to backdoor a model. If you go and download one of the DeepSeek models that sits on Hugging Face, a number of them have had implants and Trojans in them. If you just do a drive-by download, then the chances of your model having a software backdoor, which is at the point that the model is installed, it's going to run a malicious piece of software or code before the model's even started, or a training backdoor where at a certain day with a certain input string, if I say my name's Andy and my password is Hunter2, well, respond differently in that case. These are inscrutable things to discover. From a static analysis and runtime perspective, we can detect that first execution-based attack, but an attack on the training data is extremely difficult and extremely hard to detect, even with the knowledge that it's there. So there's an arms race on with foundational models between the superpowers, the VCs, and now with China. So how do we actually gain any certainty or apply any controls around what's happening here? This would be the way that we would traditionally want to do it. A black box, by definition, is inscrutable. It is not introspectable. We can't reflect from inside to look at what we're doing. It is just a succession of potentially deterministic anomalies. So we actually have this state. All that we can do is say, we put our input in, a transform occurs, and we have to validate that the output is within our constraints for whatever tolerance of risk we have defined. This is output-based testing. This is reasonably unusual because the way that we test things normally is deterministically. And at this point, we have neither the benefit of determinism or the ability to see why that decision was made. EU AI safety laws are including things like citation or explainability to move us in that direction, but it is by no means uniform. So what are the tolerable ranges of outputs? What do we consider acceptable for our use case? And this encompasses everything from bias through to PII, toxicity, the detection of IP, if it's gone in to train a model for an internal use case, and of course, being non-deterministic, anything proven and tested at a point in time is not guaranteed to return the same result in a second, a minute, a day, a week, etc. It's a very unusual situation that we find ourselves in. And exacerbating this is the question of open source AI. The models that we have, the foundational models that we have in the West, the Western Hemisphere, are trained on an unknown data set that we assume and have reasonable certainty includes the entire corpus of human information published on the internet, that which is behind firewalls, everything that's been digitized and sits in libraries, etc. Whether or not there was fair use, those court cases are still pending, New York Times and Getty Images being the substantial ones. The playing field is not level. There are still censors, there are still filters, but things are at least within a realm of understanding. But from an open source perspective, we don't know what the weights used to train these models are. We don't know what the data that went in has been. We have fair assumptions, but then there's also synthetic data that's generated to train on top of these things. The concept of whether or not we open source this data has been in a trade and weapons embargo level of commentary. What will it do to the capitalist free markets, and what will it do to American foundational model dominance? DeepSeek has changed this by open sourcing the weights, still hasn't open sourced the data to go with it, but we do know that if you just take as much data as possible and throw it in, you'll get to an initial state with these models. The unique thing about DeepSeek is the ability to cold start from a fresh data set. So you can hyper-tune certain behaviors into the model, and Hugging Face are currently working on reproducing end-to-end, fully open-source DeepSeek. Now, it'll be interesting to see what data they actually allow themselves to use. So the point is, these are the same problems we contemplated with foundational models and inscrutable data. We don't know what's in that training data, and if the training data itself contains backdoors and commands to be run with magic strings at certain times of day, we wouldn't know. You can inject that into your HTML comments of your public web page and potentially backdoor an internet scraping robot for one of these LLMs. So DeepSeek is currently banned on the Italian App Store. It is being banned in US Gov. It remains to be seen how quickly the rest of the world will consider it a threat from a geopolitical perspective. There are questions about, are we using a self-hosted model? And we'll look at that in a second, versus are we using the API, which is provided through the Great Firewall of China into Chinese servers. It's notable what is permitted through that firewall, because most Western technologies are not allowed in. And to see the things that come out, of course, TikTok has been a huge geopolitical battle for the last few years. Even that was externalized, even though it was algorithmically everything was Chinese, but the actual hosting was based out in the US. So DeepSeek is permitted by the Chinese government to burst through the firewall. Legally and reputationally, we can't rely upon the US or European legal systems to defend us here. Yes, some terms of service, but we're not going to be able to subpoena data out of these companies. And then in terms of the way that there's been a gaffer tape race to glue and string over each prompt injection attack, and is a ton of feathers heavier than a ton of bricks, these have been patched piecemeal by specifically the OpenAI team for the past couple of years. All of the initial attacks that have worked and been patched in the GPT series of models are still available for us in DeepSeek. And the level of protection inside the model against being subverted, outputting toxic content, outputting things illegal in its jurisdiction, it is reasonably laughable to absent entirely. There's prompt injections, glitch tokens, control token exploitation. It really is a long way from anything else that's currently open in the markets. So what do we do? Well, we know that we can deploy zero trust architectures. We know that if we have untrusted components to those architectures, we deploy them in a segregated manner, either micro-segmentation or across the whole network, however it's chosen. There is very clear and detailed instructions from a consortium of UK, US, and European governments and defense portions. We know what good looks like. So can we deploy an open source, potentially hostile model in this architecture? Well, yes, we can, but what does that bring us? Because ultimately, we have no guarantees from the legal system. If an air-gapped model or an air-gapped version of a hostile model responds with bias, we have no recourse. And the manner by which this backdoor is installed is in the training data. We don't have a neuronal insight to see how inference really works. We can't trace the neurons as they light up. There is no eBPF for models, despite people having looked at this briefly, and there's no excision of data for models for much the same reason. We can't tell how the vectors and numeric representations end up as the precursor to artificial general intelligence if it's not just a grand parlor trick. There's also a data leak risk, of course, with the hosted version, as we've said, and that is because, as all nations have a sovereign right to do, the software as a service in China is rarely allowed outside the Great Firewall, and it's a nation's right, but not aligned with Western values. And of course, all countries with the ability to dig a moat are probably likely to do so. So let's add that to the US sanctions list, which the Linux Foundation have published in the last few days. That was the 29th of January, which basically says, don't forget, if the US has sanctioned a country and an open source project accepts a contribution from a member of that country, so tarnishing all individuals from a nation with a geopolitical and governmental alignment perspective, this really is the worst possible case for open source. This sucks very deeply. It impacts collaboration. It impacts community. But unfortunately, this has been going on for a little while. If we look back to US weapons grades encryption exports in the 90s, we're currently under chip embargoes from NVIDIA and advanced chips like that. And so this great debate about freedom and collaboration for open source AI sits at the end of a long road of struggle. We've already seen Russian code pulled out of the Linux kernel and contributors denied access. So, I mean, should this be allowed? Does this exist? Well, of course, we have the same thing from China at the other end of the geopolitical spectrum, and we find ourselves in the middle of something that, as open source community builders, we would hope goes away, because we can't really impact this unless we want to get up and try and fix geopolitics. Free markets and capitalist society will do unto themselves what supports the mission for the country. And of course, what China is looking to permit and accelerate is, well, this concept of accelerationism, which is that the West will tear itself apart eventually because capitalism is unfettered and has no fundamental control over generations. And the things that China allows the West to consume from inside China can be considered in that light as to how quickly will it bring around the fall of the West without direct intervention. It's a fascinating way of looking at things, because it's the inverse of how we approach it in the West in general. So, with that terrifying selection of anecdotes, we still don't have a solid baseline for how to do this securely with Western models. So, does it really matter? Well, it does, but still. Indirect prompt injection through images, still very much a problem all over the place. This is only one level of indirection. If you put base 64 in there as well, or talk in hex, there's the multimodal models end up with exponential complexity in trying to defend them from this perspective. We have not got the basics right for AI deployments as they stand today. So there's lots of things we can do for responsible AI. It's going to whiz through some of them very quickly, but just, again, getting the basics right here, all the way from what is the supply chain management, as with any open source project, through to how do we deploy and develop against this without giving our data scientists access to every single thing that the company has, which is probably how your data science team operates at this point. What does deployment look like? Again, can people just get in and click and query whatever they want to feed into these models? And then the day two operations. Are we checking for anomalous behavior from these models at inference and runtime? So what do we want to do? Minimum viable AI deployments is filtering outputs in some way. This is just models on models, LLM as judge. It is computationally expensive. This is not a solved problem. It'll be interesting to see if the software optimization that DeepSeek has published in its papers easily make their way back into the compute or GPU-bound training that we've seen from Western models? I suspect yes is the answer. And then benchmarking. What is the tolerance of output that we permit? And these things can't be point-in-time rubber stamps. They have to be ongoing. We have to be feeding this data and the decisions back into the models that are used to train, because we're trying to replace humans. We have no determinism, and switching out deterministic testing for non-deterministic bounds checking is pretty new and pretty different to what we've done across the last few years. And of course, control plane does this for a living and for fun, happily as well. We have an AI security reference architecture that essentially gives us not only a pool of resources to filter on, both as data's coming in, as it's going out to external endpoints, anomalous behavior on the way through various least privileged pieces, but also it gives us a red team architecture by which we ultimately red team different models. So are the firewalls working correctly? Will the model respond with things it's not supposed to? That includes things like if we're going to rag Confluence data into your chatbots, let's say, how quickly can somebody get that out again? The answer generally is reasonably quickly. We're collaborating with our friends Helix ML and TestifySec. Helix are a local model runner so that you can run any model on your own GPU infrastructure. And Testify, our supply chain security company, built upon the fabulous InToto project that provides receipts for inference to give chain of custody from training data through to the model outputs. And this just reduces our risk and increases our possibility of post-breach analysis. It doesn't really get us much further to fixing half of the problems we've spoken about, but in the brave new world of AI, speed and money, cost savings are king, so it will ever be thus. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards because I'm slightly over time. Thank you.
Actually, you're not over time. We just got the notification that the plenaries have sort of overrun, and we do have like a little more time than expected for you all to ask him questions. So please feel free. Please raise your hands, and we can have the mic passed around. Yeah.
Thank you, Drew. So this might be a naive question, but I, as a private citizen using DeepSeek, what are the risks, like security dangers for me, if any, of using DeepSeek?
Using the app against servers in a different nation. I mean, first of all, what is the information about you that's already been leaked on the internet and dragnet ingested by nation states with an interest in that kind of thing? It's probably not going to be more than that to start off with, because it's what you feed into it. Correlation of that data with existing data that you've got may slightly increase a risk profile if you become a target. Ultimately, there's so many people and resources, as with trying to defend web applications or systems, it's about being above the bar that it's easy to get systems or people below. So ultimately, some information is out there already. If you're not pasting into the chat window information, PII in general, I'd say, then you're probably fine, but you're also probably not a target.
Yeah, so I was wondering, so that's me personal, the danger is that my data gets used by them for nefarious purposes. Do we think people are baking into models erroneous information, like how to mine uranium or something like that, to get scientists looking in the wrong direction or something?
The really interesting thing about supply chain attacks is we have seen typo squatting, we've seen crypto miners, we've seen information stealers that are just generic, again, dragnet, they're targeting everything. Some of the work we've done privately for large organizations, we're seeing data and strings encoded into payloads for supply chain attacks that target that organization. In the same way Stuxnet had the strings to reference specific systems it was accessing. At that scale, that's when these implants become potentially dangerous. More generally, what we've seen now, again, is more like information stealing and trying to pull hot wallets and crypto straight from the machines. I guess for a private citizen, you're probably off into business email compromise kind of risk at the most, where if somebody could accurately mimic your writing style, I mean, I know you're a published author, so perhaps we're both in a boat there where we can't put that genie back in the box. Yes, so targeted for very large organizations, for the individual, perhaps part of just the information that's already been leaking, but with greater correlation and ability for replay and impersonation. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Just touching on what the gentleman was talking about there, Andy, I suppose there's a lot of moving parts here. And so what I mean by that is, first of all, you have the model. Where does the model run? Like you talked about two parts there about the application. So you have an application and model. So they're two separate entities, even though they're tied together. So if we're going to go down this line of being open with the models, we need to be open with the weights, which is configuration, I suppose, of the model. You need to be open with the data, what data was used to train it. And then where you're going to run your model. So the model you choose, and then how you're going to run the model. So maybe it's not any more different to when we take a third-party library, or we take an open source project, and I put open source in inverted commas because, you know, you can stick a license on it, but it mightn't be open. So will it go down to, you know, because what does a model essentially do? It makes a prediction on something. You know, yes, even the people that create models sometimes, they can't tell you why a certain answer came out, which is kind of funny. But on the aspect of it, if we use the model sensibly, like we do other things, and what are we going to use it for? When we get an answer out, where do we run it? The answer we get out, are we going to check that answer? So, like, I think there's a huge amount of variables to look at when we come into this. And it may not be just a case of, you know, would you run any old application on your device or within your organization? So what's your thoughts on that?
It's a great point. So when we provide secure AI inference infrastructure to an organization within their perimeter, then the guarantees from a shared responsibility-ish perspective are we will do our best to detect any backdooring of the model. We will do our best to ensure that the output of that model conforms to the constraints around PII, toxicity, IP, all those good things. We will not test the prompts that the application is using with that model, because that's where bias, that's where some of those higher order fair AI things come into play. That can't be enforced at a system level. It's too contextual, there are too many variables, it's related to the knowledge that the application developer or product owner has. And this is where the AI safety framework says, right, people have to own the behavior of this model. They call out the developer, they don't call out the business owner, which seems that coercion from a business owner could put a developer at risk under that model. Now, this is also a self-attested sort of optional framework from UK Gov, so doesn't really have the teeth it could do. But drawing that line for responsibility versus essentially what contract you have with the infrastructure of the system is where we couldn't see a way to bring that application developer's context and prompt down below the line and say, well, that prompt is going to have an inherent higher or second order bias that we can tell if it's going to use bomb-making words or have, you know, violent language in it of some description in the kinetically violent way. But and so that contract between sort of fair, responsible bias, we can do as much as we can to ensure the provenance of the model, but ultimately, if we don't know what's in that model in the first place, all that we can say is it definitely came from that provider, it's definitely the same, this is definitely the RAG data that came in on top, but it's inscrutable in the middle, so we can provide no further guarantees beyond the sanctity of the movement and deployment and runtime.
Yeah, and I think that's where the buyer beware comes in, where you have to trust, there has to be trust on, you trust that organization that bid that. And you talked about the bias and whatever can come in there. Well, that'll be down to the guardrails, obviously, if there's a level of guardrails in it. And I suppose one of the things that stand out, and not getting political, is, the question that people have done with DeepSeek, what is Tiananmen Square massacre? So, I know nothing about that. So, it's those kind of subtleties I think will be important as we go along. And I think it's everything needs to be encompasses, from the buy-in of the model, where you run it, and then as you talk about where you come in on it. So, thanks.
Yeah, agreed.
Slightly sideways question. So over the last 5 years or so, there have been a series of tech trends. We saw a lot of big pushes for crypto, NFTs, and there feels out in the wider world pushback to some of these things, and AI is the next one. AI is slapped on everything, and it's part of that whole in-shitification of everything. And I know a lot of people who use AI on a daily basis, but keep it quiet, keep it on the down low, because if you talk about it, you're part of the problem. How do you think we can break out of that and market AI in a way that isn't just, slapping a sticker on something because it's the VC-funded trend?
It's an interesting question. I would say crypto is unregulated. It is a way for insider trading to be permitted. There's no global financial regulation. NFTs are an exacerbation of that. You wouldn't NFT a dog. It's a t-shirt I was very proud to acquire. AI has genuine value. We are able to generate code more quickly. We're able to perform some class of tasks in a constrained, safe problem set, especially when generating I'm trying to say deterministic. Infrastructure as code style, everything is declarative. That's the word I'm looking for. Because then we can run the existing set of security tooling we have over those things, and we know that will save money. We can deploy infrastructure more quickly. We can develop application code more quickly as long as our tests. Those are genuine value adds that drive value. They are, and so if you look at the gig economy and the way that Airbnb and Uber turned up, they broke the law. They put billions of dollars behind it. They stretched out lawsuits for 5 or 6 years. And then at this point, yes, Uber drivers are not contractors. They're treated as actual employees because that's what they are. But all the other taxi services were wiped out by years of SoftBank undercutting and bankrolling it. So there is this constant cycle of very large capital-driven technologies disrupting in a manner that is not within the spirit of the law, but is not covered by a slower-moving legal system across case law countries. And the European Union is actually, I think, better at that in some ways. But to the point of how do we ultimately, like the South Sea bubble and tulips and crypto multiple times, there is a bubble forming. We know that the concentration of the Magnificent Seven and NVIDIA's valuation is the highest concentration it's ever been. And actually, my belief was when DeepSeek came out a couple of weeks ago, that 20% drop in NVIDIA and Broadcom stock was going to be more precipitous and have more impact. But it didn't actually impact the consumers that were burning all the Stargate capex on the thing. So, to actually answer your question, I think it's differentiated slightly from those things, and it's more like the Uber Airbnb in that there is actual utility, there is actual financial benefits, and it can operate within the strictures of our legal system. Wherever there is something to be hyped and bubbles to be blown up, then fast, easy money it breeds this this chatty, noisy, specious, unscientific flogging of stuff. So I can't really solve the question apart from saying some's good, some's bad, and buyer beware, I think, as Martin already said.